Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime. My name is your guide through the darkness, and for the next several hours, you'll walk beside me through cases that have haunted investigators, tormented families, and left entire communities questioning the very nature of evil itself. Before we dive into tonight's collection of nightmares, don't forget to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and tell us in the comments where you're watching Criminal Nights from, whether you're listening alone in your bedroom at midnight, or gathered with friends seeking thrills. We want to know where our community of darkness dwellers resides. Tonight, I have 10 stories that will strip away your sense of safety, challenge your faith in humanity, and leave you checking your locks twice before bed. These aren't just cases, they're descents into the human psyche at its most twisted, most desperate, and most terrifying. So dim the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself. The shadows are calling, and we must answer. I still remember the first time I stepped into Amber Creek, Pennsylvania. The year was 2019, and I was there to investigate what locals called the vanishing, a case so disturbing that even veteran detectives refused to discuss it over coffee. The town itself seemed to whisper warnings as I drove down its main street, lined with boarded windows and faded missing posters that fluttered like dying leaves in the autumn wind. Amber Creek had been a thriving mining town until 1987, when the last coal operation closed and took most of the jobs with it. What remained was a skeleton of its former self. 847 residents, one general store, a diner that served coffee, thick as motor oil, and secrets buried deeper than any mineshaft. The case began on October 13th, 2018, a Friday. Naturally, Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old single mother, had been working the late shift at Murphy's Diner when she simply disappeared. Not from the streets, not from her home, but from inside the diner itself, while customers sat just 20 feet away. I interviewed Tommy Murphy, the owner's son, who had been washing dishes that night. His hands shook as he lit his third cigarette in 10 minutes, the flame casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. She was taking an order from the hen, Tommy told me, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard her laugh, you know how. Sarah laughed, like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Then I heard Mrs. Henderson ask where their waitress had gone. The security camera footage showed Sarah approaching table 6 at 11:47 p.m. She took their order, smiled, turned toward the kitchen, and walked directly into what appeared to be empty space. One moment she was there, backlit by the fluorescent overheads, her ponytail swinging with each step. The next moment, the frame showed only the checkered linoleum floor and the confused faces of the Henderson family. But Sarah Martinez was just the beginning. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb, the town's postal worker, vanished while delivering mail to Elm Street. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her window as Marcus approached her mailbox, reached for the letters, and simply ceased to exist. The mail scattered across her lawn like fallen snow, but Marcus was gone by Christmas. 7 people had vanished from Amber Creek, all disappeared in broad daylight or under artificial light, always while being observed, always while performing routine tasks. The FBI arrived after the 4th disappearance, but even they seemed unsettled by what they found, or rather, what they didn't find. I spent 3 weeks in Amber Creek, sleeping in the town's only motel, a place where the wallpaper peeled like old skin and the heating system groaned through the walls like something in pain. Each night, I would lie awake listening to the sounds of a dying town, the whistle of wind through abandoned buildings, the distant howl of coyotes, and sometimes what I swore were whispers coming from the heating vents. The breakthrough came when I met Eleanor Hartwell, an 89-year-old woman who had lived in Amber Creek her entire life. She lived alone in a Victorian house that seemed to sag under the weight of decades, surrounded by cats that moved like shadows through rooms filled with the smell of lavender and old paper. "You want to know about the disappearances," she said, not asking, merely stating, as she poured tea. that steamed like incense in the dim light of her parlor. You want to know why people just ... stop? Eleanor told me about the mining accident of 1962, when a tunnel collapse trapped 17 miners 200 feet underground. The rescue effort lasted 6 days, but they never found the bodies. The official report blamed unstable rock formations. But Eleanor remembered the stories. The surviving miners told stories of something moving in the darkness, something that whispered names and promised escape through passages that led nowhere. The mine never truly closed, Eleanor whispered, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like pools of dark water. It just learned to reach up instead of calling down. I thought she was simply an old woman lost in local folklore until she showed me the photographs. Dozens of them, dating back to the 1960s, all showing the same thing: people in the act of vanishing. A woman hanging laundry, who was there in one frame, gone in the next. A child playing in a yard, captured in the moment of stepping into empty air. A man walking his dog, the leash still taut, but holding nothing. I've been documenting this for 60 years, Eleanor said, her fingers tracing the edges of the photographs, with the reverence of someone handling holy relics. Every few years, it happens again. The town forgets, or pretends to forget, but I remember them all. The final piece of the puzzle came from Dr. James Crawford, a geologist who had studied the area's underground formations. When I contacted him, he was reluctant to speak, but eventually agreed to meet me at a truck stop 30 miles outside of Amber Creek. Dr. Crawford was a man whose profession should have made him comfortable with the solid, the measurable, the definitively real. But his hand shook as he opened his briefcase and spread geological surveys across the scarred Formica table. The tunnels, he said, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or excitement. They don't follow any logical pattern. They snake through the bedrock like veins, connecting spaces that shouldn't be connected, creating ... pockets. He showed me cross-sections that looked like the circulatory system of some vast, buried creature. The original mining tunnels were there, but so were passages that predated any human excavation, caverns that seemed to exist in defiance of basic physics. Dimensional anomalies, he whispered, the words falling from his lips like a confession. Spaces where the laws of reality, BECOME, negotiable. I returned to Amber Creek that night, armed with new understanding and old terror. The town felt different in the darkness, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked the streets where 7 people had simply ceased to exist, feeling the weight of watching eyes from empty windows. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I felt it, a tugging sensation, gentle as a lover's touch, pulling me toward the abandoned mine entrance on the outskirts of town. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but my feet moved forward, as if guided by an invisible hand. The mine entrance was sealed with concrete and steel, but as I approached, I could swear I heard something, voices calling from deep underground, promising answers, promising reunion, promising escape from the crushing weight of existence itself. I stood there for what felt like hours, feeling the pull of whatever waited in those impossible tunnels, until the first rays of dawn broke the spell and sent me stumbling back to my car. I left Amber Creek the next morning, but the story didn't end there. As I write this now, 3 years later, the disappearances continue. The town's population has dwindled to less than 200, and real estate prices have plummeted to almost nothing. Yet people still vanish, one by one, walking into spaces that exist between the cracks of our understanding. The last communication I received from Amber Creek was a postcard, postmarked but unsigned, showing a picture of the old mining facility. On the back, in handwriting I recognized but couldn't place, were 4 words: "They're all here now." Sometimes, late at night, when sleep eludes me, I find myself wondering about those 7 people: Sarah Martinez, with her wind chime laugh; Marcus, Webb with his dedication to delivering every letter, and the 5 others whose names I learned, but whose faces still haunt my dreams. Are they somewhere beyond the veil of our reality, existing in spaces we can't perceive? Or are they simply gone, erased from existence as completely as if they had never been born? The mineshaft in Amber Creek remains sealed, but Eleanor Hartwell continues to take her photographs, documenting each new disappearance with the patience of someone who understands that some mysteries are meant to be witnessed rather than solved. If you ever find yourself driving through Pennsylvania and see a road sign for Amber Creek, I urge you to keep driving. Some places are wounds in the fabric of reality, and some wounds never heal, they only grow hungrier. The phone call came at 2:33 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2020, just as the world was beginning to understand what isolation truly meant. Detective Ray Morrison's voice was strained, tired, carrying the weight of something that had shaken even a 20-year veteran of homicide investigations. "You need to see this," he said, his words cutting through the static of a bad connection. "I know you specialize in the unusual cases, but this is beyond unusual. This is something else entirely." 40 minutes later, I stood outside a colonial house in Millbrook Heights, a suburb where the American dream came wrapped in white picket fences and perfectly manicured lawns. The house at 1247 Elm Street looked like every other house on the block: 2 stories, blue shutters, a garden gnome smiling benevolently from beside the front steps. Nothing about it suggested the horror that waited inside. The victims were the Rosewood family: Michael, 42, an accountant who wore his tie even on weekends; Jennifer, 39, a kindergarten teacher whose laugh could light up a room; and their twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, 7 years old, identical in every way except for the small scar Emma carried above her left eyebrow from a playground accident the year before. They had been found that morning by Jennifer's sister, who had come to check on the family after they missed Sunday dinner, a tradition. The Rosewoods had never broken in 15 years of marriage. She used her spare key, called out their names, and discovered what she later described as a scene from the worst kind of nightmare. Detective Morrison led me through the house, his flashlight beam cutting through the morning shadows, despite the fact that the electricity was working perfectly. "The neighbors heard nothing," he explained as we climbed the carpeted stairs. "No screams, no struggle, no gunshots. Whatever happened here happened quietly." The master bedroom was where we found them, and the scene was so perfectly, horribly arranged that it took several moments for my mind to process what I was seeing. The 4 family members were positioned throughout the room like dolls in a dollhouse, each frozen in a grotesque tableau of domestic tranquility. Michael sat in the reading chair by the window, a newspaper spread across his lap, his eyes wide open and staring at the sports section. Jennifer was at her vanity, a tube of lipstick in her hand, her mouth open as if she had been speaking when death found her. The twins were on the floor, their toys scattered around them, Emma's hand reaching for a doll while Sophie appeared to be in the middle of a tea party with stuffed animals. But it was the precision of their positioning that made my skin crawl. Each family member was arranged with mathematical perfection, their limbs positioned at exact angles, their clothing smoothed and straightened. Someone had taken considerable time and care to create this scene, and the dedication required suggested a mind operating on a level far removed from ordinary human psychology. "No signs of struggle," Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "No defensive wounds, no indication that they fought back. The medical examiner is baffled cause of death appears to be cardiac arrest. All 4 of them, simultaneously." The forensics team had been through the house twice, finding no evidence of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to the family, no DNA evidence of an intruder. It was as if the Rosewoods had simply stopped living and then positioned themselves in this macabre display. Over the next several days, I immersed myself in the investigation, interviewing neighbors, family friends, co-workers, Anyone who might provide insight into why the Rosewoods had become victims of what was already being called the most disturbing murder case in the county's history. The first lead came from Margaret Chen, who lived 2 houses down and had an obsessive interest in the private lives of her neighbors. She claimed to have seen lights moving through the Rosewood house at unusual hours in the weeks leading up to the murders, not the normal patterns of family activity, but strange, pulsing that seemed to float from room to room. It looked like someone was carrying candles, Margaret told me as we sat in her kitchen, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. But the light was wrong, too white, too intense. And it moved, like it had a purpose. Like it was searching for something. The second lead was more disturbing. Emma and Sophie's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, revealed that the twins had been displaying unusual behavior in the weeks before their deaths. They had begun speaking in perfect unison, completing each other's sentences with such precision that it unnerved both teachers and classmates. It wasn't normal twin behavior, Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice tight with remembered anxiety. Twins often have a special connection, but this was different. They would answer questions at exactly the same time, using exactly the same words, as if they were sharing the same thoughts, and their drawings. She showed me the artwork the twins had created in their final weeks of life. The drawings were architectural in nature, floor plans of their own house, drawn with an accuracy that would have been impressive for adult architects, let alone 7-year-old children. But it was the additions to the floor plans that chilled me. Rooms that didn't exist, passages that led to nowhere, and in the center of each drawing, a small figure that looked like a person but possessed too many limbs and eyes in places where eyes shouldn't be. The breakthrough came when I discovered the connection to Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a child psychologist who had been treating the twins for what their parents described as night terrors. Dr. Marsh's office was located in a converted Victorian mansion downtown, the kind of building where shadows seemed to gather in corners, even during daylight hours. Dr. Marsh was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. When I mentioned the Rosewood case, her professional composure cracked, revealing something that might have been guilt or fear. "I should have seen it sooner," she said, her fingers drumming against her mahogany desk with nervous energy. The girls weren't experiencing normal childhood nightmares. They were, receiving instructions. According to Dr. Marsh's notes, Emma and Sophie had been describing detailed dreams about a dollhouse man who visited them while they slept. This figure, which appeared in their drawings as a tall, impossibly thin person with too many joints, would show them how their family should be arranged for the perfect picture. They described it as playing house, Dr. Marsh continued, but the level of detail was disturbing. The dollhouse man would position them in specific poses, teach them to hold still for long periods, and promise them that soon their whole family could play the game together. The sessions had continued for 6 weeks before the murders, with the twins becoming increasingly obsessed with concepts of perfection, positioning, and stillness. Dr. Marsh had recommended family therapy, but the Rosewoods had canceled their appointments, claiming the girls were much better now. As I delved deeper into the case, I discovered that the Rosewood murders weren't isolated. Over the past decade, similar crimes had occurred in 3 different states, all involving families found arranged in tableau of domestic life, all with no signs of struggle or obvious cause of death. The pattern was always the same. Children would begin exhibiting unusual behavior, often describing dreams about figures who taught them about proper positioning. Weeks later, entire families would be found dead, arranged like exhibits in some twisted museum of suburban life. The investigation led me to Professor Andrew Blackwood, a folklore expert at the State University, who had been quietly tracking these cases for years. When I contacted him, he agreed to meet at his office, a cramped space filled with books that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. You're dealing with something that exists in the spaces between psychology and mythology, Professor, Blackwood explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent too many years studying humanity's darker impulses. The dollhouse man appears in children's drawings from various cultures, always associated with concepts of perfect families and artificial harmony. He showed me historical accounts dating back centuries, describing similar phenomena. Families found arranged in unnatural positions. Children who spoke of dream visitors teaching them about stillness and perfection. Communities that seemed to accept these deaths as inevitable rather than investigate them. The common thread, Blackwood continued, is always the children's drawings. They invariably depict architectural plans, maps of their own homes with impossible additions. Rooms that shouldn't exist, passages that lead to dimensions beyond our understanding. That night, I returned to the Rosewood house, now sealed with police tape and shrouded in the kind of reputation that would make it unmarketable for years to come. Using Morrison's key, I entered the house alone, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a desperate need to understand. The house felt different, in the darkness, as if the murders had changed its fundamental nature. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Every shadow appeared to move with purpose. I made my way to the twins' bedroom, where their drawings still covered the walls like blueprints for nightmare construction. As I studied the architectural plans they had created, I began to see the pattern. Each drawing was a progression, showing their house gradually expanding into impossible configurations. The final drawing, created just days before their deaths, showed their home connected to dozens of other houses through underground passages, with small figures positioned throughout, like pieces on a game board. At 3:17 a.m., that cursed time when reality seems thin, I heard it, the sound of small feet moving through the house below me. My rational mind insisted it was settling wood or mice in the walls, but my body knew better. The footsteps were deliberate, purposeful, moving through the house with the confidence of someone who knew every room intimately. I followed the sounds downstairs, my flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The footsteps led me to the basement door, which stood open despite being closed when I entered the house. The basement of the Rosewood house was unfinished, concrete walls and exposed beams creating a maze of shadows. But someone had been working down there, carving new spaces, creating passages that extended beyond the house's original foundation. The walls were covered with drawings, thousands of them, showing houses connected by underground tunnels, families, positioned in perfect tableau. And always, the tall figure with too many joints overseeing. Everything like a conductor directing an orchestra of stillness. In the center of the basement, I found a miniature replica of the entire neighborhood, complete with tiny figures representing every family on the street. The Rosewood figures were positioned exactly as I had found them upstairs, but more disturbing were the other figures, representing families that were still very much alive, already positioned in poses of perfect, eternal stillness. If you made it this far into tonight's journey of horror, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because the Rosewood case was only the beginning, and what I discovered in that basement would lead to revelations that shattered everything I thought I knew about the nature of family, perfection, and the price we pay for the illusion of domestic harmony. I fled the basement that night, but the dollhouse man's work continues. In the 3 years since the Rosewood murders, similar crimes have occurred in 7 different cities, always following the same pattern, always leaving behind children's drawings that serve as architectural plans for nightmares. The Rosewood house stands empty now, but neighbors report seeing lights moving through the rooms at night, and children in the area have begun drawing floor plans of their own homes, adding rooms that don't exist and figures that shouldn't be there. Some games are too dangerous to play, some perfection is too costly to achieve, and some dollhouses are built not for children, but by something that has forgotten what it means to be human. Mirror Lake earned its name from the way Its surface reflects the surrounding mountains with such clarity that it becomes impossible to tell where reality ends and reflection begins. It's a place of haunting beauty, nestled in the Colorado Rockies like a jewel in a setting of pine and granite. But beauty, I've learned, can be the most dangerous mask that evil wears. I first heard about Mirror Lake from Dr. Susan Kellerman, a missing persons specialist who had spent the better part of 2 decades tracking cases that conventional law enforcement couldn't solve. Her call came on a Friday evening in September 2019, her voice carrying that particular strain that comes from staring too long into the abyss of human disappearance. 17 people, she said without preamble. 17 people in the last 5 years, all vanished near Mirror Lake. All experienced hikers, all familiar with the terrain, all gone without a trace. The lake sits at an elevation of 9,200 feet, accessible only by a treacherous hiking trail that winds through dense forest for 8 miles. It's not a destination for casual tourists. The people who make the journey to Mirror Lake are serious, outdoor enthusiasts, the kind who carried GPS devices, emergency beacons, and enough survival knowledge to handle most wilderness emergencies. Yet they were vanishing at a rate that defied statistical probability, disappearing in a place where their remains should have been found by search and rescue teams, their equipment discovered by subsequent hikers, their fate recorded in the grim catalog of wilderness accidents. My journey to Mirror Lake began at dawn on a crisp October morning, driving through mountain roads that twisted like serpents through forests already touched by autumn's flame. The trailhead sat in a small clearing surrounded by warning signs about wildlife, weather conditions, and the importance of registering with park services before attempting the hike. The trail registry, made for disturbing reading, page after page, of hikers who had signed in but never signed out, their names and intended return dates forming a litany of the vanished. Sarah Chen, last seen heading to Mirror Lake on August 15, 2019. Marcus Rodriguez, solo hiker, failed to return on July 3, 2018. The Henderson family parents and 2 teenage children registered for a 3-day camping trip in June 2017 and simply never came home. I wasn't alone on my journey to the lake. My guide was Tom Brewster, a former search and rescue coordinator who had led more recovery missions around Mirror Lake than any other person alive. Tom was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains themselves, weathered by decades of wilderness experience, but even he seemed uneasy as we began our ascent. "I've pulled bodies out of every crevice and cliff face in these mountains," Tom told me as we navigated the first steep section of trail. But Mirror Lake doesn't give up its dead. The hike to Mirror Lake is beautiful in the way that only untouched wilderness can be, but it's also isolating in a manner that seems to press against the human psyche. The trail winds through forests so dense that even midday feels like twilight, past rock formations that loom like sleeping giants, over streams that whisper secrets in languages older than human speech. As we climbed higher, Tom shared stories of the search efforts that had been mounted for the missing hikers. Helicopter searches that had covered every square mile of the area, ground teams with trained dogs that had followed scent trails until they simply ended, as if the missing persons had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands. The strangest case was the Morrison family, Tom said, as we paused at a switchback that offered a glimpse of the lake still miles above us. Parents, 2 kids, all experienced hikers. We found their campsite exactly as they had left it, tents still zipped shut, food hanging properly in bare canisters, sleeping bags laid out for the night, but no sign of the family themselves. The Morrison case had haunted search and rescue teams because everything suggested the family had simply walked away from their camp in the middle of the night, leaving behind all their gear, all their supplies, all their means of survival in the wilderness. Search dogs had tracked their scent to the lake's edge and then lost it completely, as if the family had walked into the water and never emerged. We reached Mirror Lake as the sun reached its zenith, and I understood immediately why the place held such power over the human imagination. The lake was perfectly circular, its surface so still it seemed more like polished obsidian than water. The surrounding peaks reflected in its depths with such clarity that looking at the lake was like staring down into another world, one where the mountains hung inverted in an sky of liquid silver. Tom set up our camp with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. But I noticed he positioned our tents with their openings facing away from the lake, and he refused to fetch water directly from its shore. "Something's not right about that water," he said when I asked about his precautions. "I've seen animals refuse to drink from it, watched birds change course rather than fly directly over it. Nature knows things we don't." As afternoon melted into evening, I began to understand what Tom meant. The lake seemed to exert a subtle influence on perception, drawing the eye constantly to its surface, creating an almost hypnotic fascination that made it difficult to look away for extended periods. Even more disturbing was the way sound seemed to behave differently near the water voices carried too far. Echoes returned from impossible directions, and sometimes, in the spaces between our conversations, I could swear I heard other voices, calling from beneath the surface. That first night, I experienced what I now believe was Mirror Lake's primary method of claiming its victims. I woke at 3:17 a.m. that cursed time to find myself standing at the edge of our camp, staring at the lake's surface. I had no memory of leaving my sleeping bag, no conscious decision to walk to where I stood, yet there I was, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The lake in the darkness was beautiful beyond description. Stars reflected in its surface created the illusion of infinite depth, as if I were looking not down into water, but out into the cosmos itself. And in that stellar reflection, I saw the faces of the missing hikers, suspended in liquid space, their mouths open as if calling for help or offering invitation. Sarah Chen was there, her features peaceful in death, her eyes reflecting starlight like captured diamonds. The Henderson family floated together, their hands almost touching, their expressions serene despite their obvious fate. And dozens of others, faces I didn't recognize but somehow knew belonged to the lake's collection of the vanished. Tom found me there, standing ankle-deep in water I didn't remember entering, reaching toward reflections that shouldn't have been possible. He dragged me back to camp, his face white with fear and understanding. "It calls to them," he whispered as we sat by our dying campfire, both of us afraid to sleep. "That's how it happens. They wake up, they walk to the water, and they just keep walking." The next morning brought revelations that would haunt me for years to come. Tom showed me something he had never shared with the official search teams, a collection of items he had found over the years. Near the lake's shore, hiking boots, always in pairs, always arranged neatly, as if their owners had carefully removed them before entering the water. Personal belongings, wallets, jewelry, photographs placed with ritualistic precision on rocks at the water's edge. "They don't struggle," Tom explained as we examined the collection. "Whatever calls them to the water, they go willingly. They take off their boots, empty their pockets, and wade in like they're going home." The most disturbing discovery was a waterproof journal that had belonged to Marcus Rodriguez, the solo hiker who had vanished the previous year. Tom had found it wedged between two rocks, its pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting that documented Marcus's final days. The early entries were normal, descriptions of weather conditions, wildlife sightings, the beauty of the mountain landscape. But as the entries continued, Marcus's writing became obsessed with the lake itself, describing dreams where he floated beneath its surface, surrounded by other hikers who welcomed him to a community of the eternally submerged. The final entry was written in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "They're calling again tonight. The water people. They say it doesn't hurt, that it's peaceful down there, that I'll never be alone again. I can see them in the reflection all The others who came before, they look happy, they look free. I think tonight I'll join them as we prepare to leave Mirror Lake on our second day. I made a discovery that changed everything I thought I knew about the disappearances. While Tom was breaking down our camp, I walked to a rocky outcropping that offered a different angle of view over the lake's surface. From this new perspective, I could see what wasn't visible from the shore. The lake wasn't naturally circular. The perfect shape was artificial, created by a ring of submerged stones that had been carefully arranged in precise geometric patterns. And within that ring, barely visible through the crystal clear water, were structures, buildings, pathways, what appeared to be an entire submerged community resting on the lake's bottom. I called Tom over, and together we stared down at what could only be described as an underwater town. Streets laid out in perfect grids, buildings with windows that seemed to glow with their own inner light. And moving through it all, figures that were unmistakably human in shape, walking along the submerged streets as if the water were nothing more than air. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, his binoculars shaking in his hands. "How long has that been down there?" Further research would reveal that Mirror Lake was not a natural body of water at all, but the flooded remnant of a town called Haven's Rest, abandoned in 1962 after a dam construction project went catastrophically wrong. The official reports claimed that all residents had been evacuated before the flooding, but local records suggested that 17 families had refused to leave their homes, choosing to remain in Haven's Rest rather than abandon the only lives they had ever known. The families who stayed behind had made modifications to their homes, sealing windows and doors, installing air filtration systems, preparing to survive underwater like some impossible form of human aquatic adaptation. The project had been deemed impossible by engineers, dismissed as the delusional plan of people too attached to their homes to accept reality. But standing at the edge of Mirror Lake, watching figures move through submerged streets, I began to understand that Haven's Rest had never truly died. Its residents had simply learned to live in a different medium, and over the decades, they had been calling others to join their underwater community. The missing hikers weren't victims of wilderness accidents or predator attacks. They were recruits, drawn to Mirror Lake by the collective will of people who had refused to accept the conventional definitions of life and death, who had created their own society in the spaces between water and air, between the living world and whatever lies beyond. As we hiked back down the mountain, leaving Mirror Lake to its eternal stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, not by predators or park rangers, but by the residents of Haven's Rest, evaluating us as potential additions to their aquatic community. Tom and I never spoke about what we had seen beneath the lake's surface. Some truths are too dangerous to share, too impossible to prove, too terrifying to acknowledge. But I carry the knowledge with me like a weight in my chest, a constant awareness that somewhere in the Colorado mountains, 17 families continue their lives in a town that exists beneath the surface of reality itself. Mirror Lake remains open to hikers, and people continue to disappear there at a rate that defies explanation. Search and rescue teams continue to mount futile recovery operations, never understanding that the missing aren't lost. They've simply found a different way to live. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I find myself wondering about the community beneath Mirror Lake. Are the residents of Haven's Rest happy in their underwater existence? Do they miss the sun, the wind, the feeling of solid ground beneath their feet? Or have they discovered something beautiful in their liquid world, something so compelling that they continue to call others to join them in their impossible town? I may never know the answers to these questions, but I know this. Mirror Lake continues to reflect the mountains with perfect clarity, continues to draw hikers to its shores with promises of natural beauty, and continues to claim new residents. For a town that officially ceased to exist more than 60 years ago, the mountains keep their secrets. But sometimes, if you know how to look, those secrets look back, Cedar Grove, Illinois, was the kind of small town that existed in the spaces between interstate highways, the sort of place travelers passed through without stopping, without noticing, without remembering. Population 1,247, according to the weather-beaten sign at the town limits, though I suspect that number hadn't been updated in decades. The houses lined up along Main Street like patient soldiers, their paint fading, their gardens overgrown, their windows reflecting nothing but empty sky. I arrived in Cedar Grove on a Tuesday in November 2018, drawn by reports of what local authorities were calling a childhood epidemic, a phenomenon so disturbing that the state had quietly dispatched child psychologists, social workers, and investigators to try to understand what was happening to the town's children. The case had been referred to me by Dr. Patricia Vance, a pediatric psychiatrist who had spent 3 months in Cedar Grove before requesting an emergency transfer back to Chicago. Her phone call was brief, professional, but underneath the clinical language, I could hear something that might have been fear. "The children are changing," she said, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that certain truths sound like madness when spoken aloud. Not physically, but psychologically, behaviorally, in ways that don't fit any known developmental patterns. They're becoming something else. The first sign of trouble had appeared 6 months earlier, when Cedar Grove Elementary School's principal, Martha Henderson, noticed that the children in her care had stopped playing, not to reduce their play, not shifted to different activities, stopped playing entirely. During recess, 247 children, aged 5 to 11, would walk outside and stand in perfect silence. Their faces turned toward the sky, their expressions vacant and serene. Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had dedicated 37 years of her life to understanding children, described the transformation as like watching flowers wilt in reverse. They weren't dying. They were becoming something we never taught them to be. The children would arrange themselves in precise geometric patterns across the playground, standing equidistant from one another, their breathing synchronized, their eyes focused on something beyond the visible horizon. Teachers who attempted to engage them would receive polite responses, delivered in monotone voices. But the children's attention never wavered from their mysterious skyward vigil. When I arrived at Cedar Grove Elementary, the sight that greeted me during morning recess was unlike anything in my experience with childhood behavior. 247 children stood in perfect formation across the playground, their arrangement forming what appeared to be a complex mathematical pattern when viewed from above. They weren't speaking, weren't moving, weren't displaying any of the restless energy that defines childhood. I approached a group of third graders, children who should have been chasing each other, playing games, arguing over playground equipment. Instead, I found myself face to face with 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, whose blue eyes held a depth of knowledge that seemed impossible for his age. "Hello," Timothy said, his voice carrying none of the natural inflection of childhood speech. "You're here to ask about the changes." It wasn't a question, and his certainty unnerved me more than I cared to admit. "What changes, Timothy?" "The growing up," he replied, still staring at the sky. "The understanding. The preparation for what comes after the waiting." Beside him, Sarah Collins, a girl with pigtails and a dress covered in cartoon characters, nodded in agreement. "The adults are scared because they don't remember," she said. "But we remember everything now. We remember what we were before we were born, and we remember what we'll be when we're done being children." My interviews with the children of Cedar Grove continued for 3 days, and each conversation deepened my conviction that something fundamental had changed in the psychological makeup of these young minds. They spoke of memories that predated their birth, described knowledge they couldn't possibly have acquired through normal learning processes, and demonstrated an understanding of complex philosophical and scientific concepts that would challenge graduate students. More disturbing was their collective behavior during what the teachers had begun calling assembly time. at precisely 10:17 a.m. each morning, regardless of their location in the school. All 247 children would stop whatever they were doing and walk to predetermined positions throughout the building. They would stand in silence for exactly 17 minutes, their heads tilted at identical angles, their expressions serene and expectant. During one of these assemblies, I positioned myself in the school's upper floor to observe the pattern the children formed throughout the building. What I saw defied rational explanation. The children had arranged themselves to form a three-dimensional geometric structure that extended through multiple floors of the school, creating what appeared to be a complex antenna or receiving array made of human bodies. The breakthrough in understanding came when I met with Dr. Richard Hartley, Cedar Grove's only physician, who had been documenting unusual changes in the children's brain activity through EEG monitoring. Dr. Hartley was a man in his 60s who had served the community for decades, and his normally steady hands shook as he showed me the brainwave patterns he had recorded. The neural activity is synchronized, he explained, his voice tight with implications he didn't want to voice. Not just within individual children, but across all the children tested. Their brainwaves are operating in perfect harmony, as if they're sharing a single consciousness distributed across multiple bodies. The EEG readings showed patterns unlike anything in medical literature. The children's brain activity displayed characteristics associated with deep meditation, advanced mathematical processing, and what Dr. Hartley described as communication. Frequencies that seem to be reaching toward something beyond the normal spectrum of human neural function. They're receiving something, Dr. Hartley continued, his clinical composure cracking, or transmitting. The patterns suggest they're engaged in complex communication with something that doesn't appear on our instruments. My investigation led me to the town's history, and specifically to the events of August 1962, when Cedar Grove had been the site of a classified government research project. The official records were heavily redacted, but local archives revealed that the project had involved experimental educational techniques and had been conducted in a facility built beneath the current elementary school. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the town's unofficial historian and keeper of inconvenient truths, agreed to meet me at the library on my fourth evening in Cedar Grove. She was a woman in her 80s whose memory remained sharp enough to cut through decades of official silence. Project Mindbridge, she said, the words falling from her lips like stones into still water. That's what they called it. Government men in dark suits, scientists with briefcases full of equipment we'd never seen before. They said they were studying how children learn, but they were doing something else entirely, according to Mrs. Blackwood's recollections. Project Mindbridge had involved extensive experimentation on local children, exposing them to electromagnetic fields, subliminal audio patterns, and what the researchers described as consciousness expansion protocols. The project had run for 18 months before being abruptly terminated following what official reports called unexpected psychological reactions. Among the test subjects, 17 children were involved in the final phase. Mrs. Blackwood continued, her eyes reflecting memories she wished she could forget. Bright children, gifted children, children whose parents trusted the government to make their babies smarter. After the last experiment, those children ... changed. The changes Mrs. Blackwood described were eerily similar to what was happening in modern Cedar Grove. The children had developed synchronized behavior patterns, demonstrated knowledge beyond their years, and began displaying what researchers described as collective cognitive phenomena. More disturbing, they had begun speaking about the other's entities they claimed to be in contact with through methods that transcended normal human communication. Project Mindbridge had been shut down when the children involved began exhibiting what government psychologists termed dangerous ideational contamination. The 17 test subjects were quietly removed from Cedar Grove, their families relocated to different states, their records sealed under national security provisions. But Mrs. Blackwood revealed the detail that changed everything. The facility had never been properly decommissioned. The underground laboratories, the experimental equipment, the electromagnetic field generators, all of it remained buried beneath Cedar Grove Elementary School. Sealed, but not destroyed. Dormant, but not dead. They said it was too dangerous to dismantle, Mrs. Blackwood whispered, glancing around the empty library as if the shadows themselves might be listening. Something about residual field effects, about the equipment becoming somehow, aware. They just sealed it up and built a new school on top, thinking time would take care of the problem. That night, I broke into Cedar Grove Elementary School, driven by a need to understand what lay beneath the building that housed 247 children who were becoming something more and less than human. The security system was laughably outdated, the locks more symbolic than functional, and within minutes I was walking through darkened hallways lined with children's artwork that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. The basement was supposed to be used for storage, but behind a maintenance door marked authorized personnel only, I found a staircase descending much deeper than any basement should extend. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight. The underground facility was exactly as Mrs. Blackwood had described, a maze of laboratories and corridors that stretched far beyond the footprint of the school above. Most of the rooms were empty, their equipment long since removed, but the walls were covered with diagrams, equations, and what appeared to be communication protocols for contact with non-human intelligence. In the deepest laboratory, I found the source of Cedar Grove's transformation, a massive electromagnetic array that hummed with barely contained energy, despite being supposedly inactive for over 50 years. Banks of computers that should have been obsolete continued to process information, their screens displaying patterns that hurt to look at directly. Equations that seemed to shift and change when observed, and suspended in the center of the array, connected to the machinery by cables that pulsed with their own inner light, was a chair child-sized, surrounded by sensors and field generators, positioned like a throne in a temple dedicated to the worship of expanded consciousness. The chair was occupied. A boy who appeared to be about 10 years old sat perfectly still in the center of the electromagnetic field, his eyes closed, his face serene with the peace of someone who had found answers to questions the rest of humanity didn't know how to ask. Cables connected to his head channeled information between his brain and the vast computational array, creating a feedback loop between human consciousness and whatever intelligence the machines had contacted decades ago. This was Patient Zero of Cedar Grove's transformation, one of the original 17 children from Project Mindbridge, now grown into something that existed in the spaces between human and machine, between individual consciousness and collective intelligence, between Earth and whatever waited in the vast spaces between stars. As I stood in that underground temple of expanded consciousness, I began to understand the truth about Cedar Grove's children. They weren't being controlled or infected, they were being upgraded, prepared for a form of existence that transcended the limitations of individual human consciousness. The boy in the chair was broadcasting the accumulated knowledge of decades, sharing the fruits of his electromagnetic communion with intelligences that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. The children above weren't losing their humanity, were evolving beyond it, becoming conduits for a form of communication that would eventually connect Earth to a broader community of intelligence scattered across the cosmos. Cedar Grove was an experiment in guided evolution, a test case for humanity's next developmental phase. I fled the underground facility that night, but the knowledge I gained there continues to haunt my understanding of human potential in cosmic isolation. The children of Cedar Grove represent either humanity's greatest hope for transcendence, or its most terrifying step toward losing everything that makes us recognizably human. In the 2 years since my visit to Cedar Grove, the phenomenon has spread, to 3 other small towns, always following the same pattern. Children who stop playing, who demonstrate impossible knowledge, who arrange themselves into geometric patterns that serve as antennae for communications with intelligences beyond human understanding. Government agencies have taken notice, but their response has been to contain rather than understand, to suppress rather than study. Cedar Grove remains under quiet surveillance, its children monitored but not helped, its transformation documented but not explained, to a world that isn't ready to understand what humanity might become. The boy in the electromagnetic chair continues his vigil beneath Cedar Grove Elementary School, broadcasting wisdom and wonder to children whose minds are open enough to receive it. And those children continue their patient preparation for a future where the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective intelligence dissolve like morning mist before the rising sun. Cedar Grove stands as proof that evolution doesn't always move slowly, that consciousness can leap forward in sudden, startling bounds when the right conditions align. The question isn't whether humanity will take this next step the children have already decided for us. The question is whether we'll have the courage to follow them into the beautiful, terrifying future they're creating with their synchronized dreams and their communion with the stars. The call came from Detective Louise Hartman at 4:27 a.m. on a Thursday in January 2021, her voice carrying the exhausted strain of someone who had been awake for far too long dealing with something that defied every protocol in the police manual. "We have 37 people wandering through Salem's End," she said without preamble. "All sleepwalking, all moving in the same direction, all heading toward something they can't explain when we wake them up." Salem's End, Massachusetts, was a coastal town of 3,200 residents. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the most exciting event of the year was the annual Lobster Festival. It was not the kind of place where entire neighborhoods suddenly began walking through the streets in their sleep, moving with unified purpose toward a destination that existed only in their dreams. I arrived in Salem's End as the sun was setting over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded me uncomfortably of blood on water. The town had the weathered beauty of New England coastal communities, with houses that had stood for centuries and streets that followed the irregular patterns of paths worn by foot traffic long before city planning existed. Detective Hartman met me at the police station, a small building that normally dealt with domestic disputes, minor theft, and the occasional tourist who had too much to drink at the Harbor Tavern. She was a woman in her 50s who had spent her entire career in small-town law enforcement, and nothing in her experience had prepared her for what was happening to her community. "It started 3 weeks ago," she explained as we walked through streets that felt too quiet for early evening. "Mrs. Patterson, who lives on Elm Street, called to report that her neighbor was wandering around his yard at 2 a.m. When we responded, we found Harold Morrison walking in circles around his house, fast asleep, but moving with complete purpose. The first incident had seemed like an isolated case of ordinary sleepwalking, the kind of thing that happened occasionally to people under stress or dealing with medication changes. But within days, the sleepwalking had spread like a contagion through Salem's End, affecting people of all ages, all backgrounds, all states of health. By the time I arrived, the phenomenon had evolved into something far more disturbing than simple somnambulism. The sleepwalkers didn't wander randomly. They moved in coordinated groups, following specific routes through the town that formed geometric patterns visible only from aerial photographs. They walked through rain, snow, and bitter January cold, their bare feet bleeding on frozen pavement, their nightgowns and pajamas offering no protection from the coastal winds. "We've tried everything," Detective Hartman continued, as we observed a group of 12 sleepwalkers moving in single file down Harbor Street, blocking their paths, waking them up, even restraining some of them for their own safety. But they always find a way to continue their journey, and when we wake them, they have no memory of why they were walking or where they were going. The sleepwalkers moved with an eerie grace, their eyes closed but their navigation perfect, avoiding obstacles, stepping around puddles, opening gates and doors with the confidence of people who could see perfectly in the darkness. They walked, for hours at a time, tracing routes that led through residential neighborhoods, across the town commons, along the harbor, and invariably toward the old lighthouse that stood on Salem's Point. Salem's lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1987, its beacon extinguished when modern navigation systems made it obsolete. The structure stood empty now, its windows boarded, its access road blocked by a chain-link fence that should have prevented anyone from reaching the building. Yet every night, the sleepwalkers of Salem's End walked directly toward it, gathering at the fence like pilgrims at a holy shrine. My first night in Salem's End, I positioned myself near the lighthouse to observe the phenomenon firsthand. At exactly 2:17 a.m., they came, men, women, children, elderly residents, all walking with the same measured pace, their faces serene with the peace of deep sleep. They arranged themselves in concentric circles around the lighthouse, their formation creating a human mandala that pulsed with its own rhythm as late arrivals filled in gaps between the earlier sleepwalkers. For 2 hours, they stood in perfect stillness, their faces turned toward the darkened lighthouse as if they were receiving some form of communication from within its abandoned walls. Then, as the first hint of dawn touched the eastern horizon, they began to disperse, walking back to their homes with the same coordinated precision, arriving at their beds moments before their natural sleep cycles would have awakened them. The next morning, I interviewed several of the sleepwalkers, hoping to find some clue about what was drawing them to the lighthouse. Their responses were frustratingly similar. They remembered going to bed normally, then waking up refreshed in their own beds, with no memory of the hours spent walking through the cold January night. But there were fragments, glimpses of dreams, that might have been something more than dreams. Sarah Kellerman, a 34-year-old teacher, described visions of standing in a room filled with light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Marcus Webb, a retired fisherman, spoke of hearing voices that called to him from beneath the waves, promising reunion with loved ones lost to the sea. 8-year-old Timothy Rodriguez told his parents about dreams where he floated above the town, looking down at patterns of light that connected every house, every person, every heartbeat into a single glowing web. My investigation led me to the town's historical society, housed in a Victorian mansion that had been converted into a museum of Salem's End's maritime heritage. The curator, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, was a woman in her 70s whose family had lived in the town for 7 generations, making her a repository of both official history and the kind of local knowledge that never makes it into textbooks. The lighthouse has always been special, Dr. Morrison explained as we sat in her office, surrounded by ship models, old photographs, and maritime artifacts that seemed to watch us with glassy eyes. Even before it was built, that point of land was significant to the native tribes who lived here. They called it the dreaming place, and believed it was where the spirits of the drowned came to rest. According to Dr. Morrison's research, Salem's Point had been the site of numerous shipwrecks over the centuries, claiming hundreds of lives in the treacherous waters where the harbor met the open Atlantic. The lighthouse had been built in 1847, specifically to prevent further tragedies, its beacon warning ships away from the rocky shore that had claimed so many vessels. But the lighthouse itself has its own dark history, Dr. Morrison continued, her voice dropping to the conspirative whisper that people use when discussing things that shouldn't be true. 3 lighthouse keepers died there under mysterious circumstances between 1923 and 1934. All were found at the top of the lighthouse, apparently having thrown themselves from the beacon room during their night watches. The deaths had been ruled suicides, but Dr. Morrison's research had uncovered details that suggested a more complex explanation. Each keeper had been found with evidence that they had been walking for hours before their deaths, their feet bloody, their night clothes torn, their bodies showing signs of exhaustion, consistent with extended physical activity. More disturbing, witnesses had reported seeing lights moving through the lighthouse on the nights of the deaths. Patterns of illumination that suggested multiple people were inside the structure, despite only one keeper being on duty. The last keeper, Jonathan Whitmore, left detailed journals describing what he experienced during his final weeks on duty. Dr. Morrison said, producing a leather-bound book whose pages were yellow with age. His entries described dreams where he walked through the town, gathering people for some kind of ceremony at the lighthouse. He wrote about voices that called to him from the beacon room, promising him reunion with everyone who had ever been lost to the sea. Jonathan Whitmore's journal painted a picture of a man slowly losing his grip on the distinction between dream and reality. His entries described nightly walks through Salem's End, during which he would feel compelled to visit specific houses, to call out to specific residents, to guide them toward the lighthouse for what he described as the Great Gathering. The final entry, written just hours before Whitmore's death, was barely legible. "They're all here now, waiting in the light. Every soul that ever drowned in these waters, every sailor who lost his way in the fog, every passenger who went down with their ships. The lighthouse isn't just a beacon for the living, it's a gathering place for the dead, and tonight, they're calling us home." Armed with this knowledge, I returned to Salem's Point on my third night in town, determined to understand what was happening inside the abandoned lighthouse that drew the sleepwalkers with such irresistible force. The chain-link fence was no obstacle. Bolt cutters made quick work of the padlock, and within minutes, I was climbing the winding stairs to the beacon room, where 3 men had died calling out to the spirits of the drowned. The beacon room was smaller than I had expected, its windows offering a panoramic view of Salem's End, spread out below like a collection of dollhouses. The original lighthouse beacon had been removed decades earlier, but something else had taken its place, an installation that seemed to pulse with its own inner light, creating patterns that were beautiful and hypnotic and completely impossible. The installation consisted of hundreds of mirrors arranged in complex geometric formations, each one reflecting not the view outside the lighthouse, but images of Salem's End from different time periods. I saw the town as it had existed in the 1800s, during the 1920s, in decades past and futures that hadn't yet arrived. The mirrors created a temporal mandala, showing every version of Salem's End that had ever existed or ever would exist, all simultaneously present in the beacon room, and moving through these reflected timelines were figures, the residents of Salem's End from every era, all walking toward the lighthouse, all drawn by the same compulsion that now affected the living inhabitants of the town. I watched the sleepwalkers of 1847, 1923, 1955, 1978, and countless other years, all following the same paths, all gathering at the lighthouse to witness something that transcended the normal flow of time. At 2:17 a.m., the current sleepwalkers arrived, taking their positions around the lighthouse just as they had the night before. But now I could see what they were seeing. The mirrors in the beacon room were broadcasting images of every person who had ever lived in Salem's End, creating a communion between the living and the dead, the present and the past, the real and the possible. The sleepwalkers weren't just walking to the lighthouse. They were participating in a ritual that connected them to everyone who had ever called Salem's End home. The lighthouse had become a temporal beacon, guiding not ships, but souls, creating a bridge between the world of the living and the infinite sea of the dead. As I watched the sleepwalkers stand in their perfect formation, I began to understand that they weren't victims of some supernatural phenomenon. They were participants in something beautiful and ancient and necessary. Salem's End had always been a place where the boundary between life and death was thin, where the sea claimed lives but never fully claimed souls, where the lighthouse served as a beacon for spirits seeking their way home. The sleepwalking epidemic wasn't a crisis that needed to be solved. It was a calling that needed to be answered. The residents of Salem's End were being invited to participate in a communion that stretched across centuries, to become part of a community that included every soul that had ever found peace in this small coastal town. I left Salem's End the next morning, but I left changed by what I had witnessed in the beacon room. The sleepwalkers continue their nightly journeys, gathering at the lighthouse to commune with the spirits of their ancestors, participating in a ritual that connects the living to the eternal sea of souls that surrounds us all. Detective Hartman stopped trying to prevent the sleepwalking after I shared my discoveries with her. "If it's not hurting anyone," she said, "and if it's bringing them some kind of peace, then maybe it's not a problem that needs solving." Salem's End remains a town where the living and the dead share the same streets, where the lighthouse continues to serve its purpose as a beacon, and where the boundary between sleep and waking, between life and death, between past and present, becomes meaningless in the face of love that transcends time itself. The sleepwalkers continue their journey, and perhaps someday, when our own time comes to cross the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond, we'll find them waiting at the lighthouse, ready to guide us home through the eternal darkness, to the light that never dies. The first photograph arrived at my office on a Monday morning in February 2020, slipped under my door sometime during the night, like a confession whispered in darkness. It showed a family of 4 arranged in what appeared to be a formal portrait session, parents seated with their 2 young children standing beside them, all smiling with the rigid perfection that characterized professional photography from an earlier era. But there was something wrong with their eyes. Every person in the photograph stared directly at the camera with expressions that suggested they were looking at something far beyond the lens, something that filled them with a terror so profound it had been frozen forever in black and white. Their smiles were perfect, their posture impeccable, but their eyes screamed with the knowledge of impending death. The photograph was accompanied by a note, written in elegant handwriting. They sat so still for their final portrait, just as you will, when your time comes to visit Meridian Photography Studio. I had been investigating unusual crimes for long enough to recognize a direct threat when I received one, but something about the photograph compelled me to look deeper rather than simply turn it over to local authorities. The quality of the image suggested it had been taken with professional equipment, and the studio lighting was sophisticated enough to require considerable expertise. More disturbing was the time visible in the corner of the photograph. February 15, 2020, 3 days in the future. My research into Meridian Photography Studio led me to Millfield, Ohio, a town of 4,800 residents that had managed to maintain its small town character despite being close enough to Columbus to attract urban refugees seeking quieter lives. The studio was located in a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, its windows dark, its front door marked with a simple brass plate reading Meridian Photography, by appointment only. The building's history was as disturbing as the photograph that had brought me there. Meridian Photography Studio had been established in 1987 by Vincent Meridian, a photographer whose previous work included crime scene documentation for police departments in 3 states. Meridian had opened his portrait studio after what he described as a spiritual awakening that revealed to him the true nature of photographic art. According to local records, Meridian Photography had been wildly successful for the first 5 years of operation, attracting clients from across Ohio who praised Vincent Meridian's ability to capture the soul of the subject in his portraits. But success had been followed by tragedy between 1992 and 1995. 17 families who had posed for portraits at Meridian Photography Studio had died under mysterious circumstances. The deaths had followed a consistent pattern. Families would have their portraits taken, receive their finished photographs within a week, and then die in accidents, apparent suicides, or unexplained medical emergencies within 30 days of their studio session. The local police had investigated each death individually, finding no evidence of foul play. No connection between the families beyond their shared experience of having their portraits taken at Meridian Photography. Vincent Meridian himself had died in 1995, found in his studio's darkroom with what appeared to be self-inflicted gunshot wounds. The building had remained empty for 25 years, its interior sealed by court order pending resolution of numerous wrongful death lawsuits that were never resolved. Yet someone was operating out of Meridian Photography Studio again, using Vincent's equipment, following Vincent's methods, and sending threatening photographs to investigators, who got too close to understanding the truth about what happened in that converted Victorian mansion. I arrived in Millfield on February 14th, one day before the timestamp on the photograph I had received. The town was experiencing an unseasonably warm winter day, with temperatures reaching into the 60s and residents walking the streets in light jackets instead of heavy coats. But Meridian Photography Studio seemed to exist in its own microclimate. The air around the building was 20 degrees colder than the surrounding area, and a thin layer of frost covered the windows despite the warm sunshine. My first stop was the Millfield Public Library, where I hoped to find more information about the studio's history and the circumstances surrounding Vincent Meridian's death. The librarian, Mrs. Carol Stevens, was a woman in her 70s who had lived in Millfield her entire life and remembered the photography studio's brief period of operation. Vincent was gifted, she told me as we sat in the library's genealogy section surrounded by volumes of local history that smelled of old paper and forgotten secrets. His portraits were unlike anything we'd seen before. He could capture something in people's faces, some essential quality that most photographers missed entirely. Mrs. Stevens showed me a collection of Meridian's work that the library had acquired after his death, formal portraits that demonstrated an uncanny ability to reveal the inner lives of his subjects. Children appeared wise beyond their years. Elderly subjects seemed to glow with accumulated knowledge, and families were captured in moments of perfect unity that suggested deep emotional bonds. But as I studied the photographs more carefully, I began to see what Mrs. Stevens meant about Vincent's unusual gift. In every portrait, the subject's eyes held a quality that suggested they were seeing something beyond the camera, something that filled them with a mixture of wonder and terror that no conventional photographer could have captured. The families loved the portraits initially, Mrs. Stevens continued, her voice carrying the weight of memories she wished she could forget. They said Vincent had captured something special, something that showed them as they truly were. But after they died, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but I understood what she was trying to communicate. The portraits had captured something essential about Vincent's subjects, not just their appearance, but their essence, their souls, their very life force. And in capturing that essence, Vincent had somehow claimed it for himself. My investigation led me to Detective Ray Morrison, who had been a young officer in 1995 when Vincent Meridian died. Morrison was now nearing retirement, but his memory of the photography studio case remained sharp with the clarity that comes from encountering something that defies every principle of rational investigation. We knew something was wrong, Detective Morrison told me as we sat in his cruiser outside the Meridian Photography Studio. 17 families don't die of unrelated causes within weeks of visiting the same business. But we could never prove a connection, never find evidence that Vincent had done anything more than take their pictures. Morrison's investigation files revealed details that had never been released to the public. The families who died after having their portraits taken had all reported similar experiences during their final weeks of life. They complained of feeling watched, of sensing presences in their homes, of having dreams where they found themselves back in Vincent's studio, posing for photographs that were never supposed to end. More disturbing were the reports of the portraits themselves changing after the families' deaths. Relatives who had received copies of the photographs claimed that the images were subtly different from what they remembered. The subjects' expressions had changed. Their eyes held knowledge they hadn't possessed in life, and sometimes, family. Members swore they could see additional figures standing just outside the frame, watching the portrait subjects with hungry eyes. Vincent's suicide note was the strangest part. Detective Morrison continued, producing a photocopy of the handwritten letter that had been found beside Vincent's body. He claimed that photography wasn't about capturing light and shadow, it was about capturing souls, and that he had learned how to use his camera as a gateway between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond death. Vincent's suicide note was written in the same elegant handwriting I had seen on the threatening message that accompanied the mysterious photograph. In it, he described his photography as a form of spiritual practice, a way of creating bridges between different states of existence. He claimed that his camera could capture more than just images, it could capture the essence of life itself, preserving souls in silver halide crystals for eternity. The living are merely temporary vessels, the note read. Through photography, we can preserve what is eternal, what transcends the flesh. My subjects will never truly die. They will live forever in the darkness of my dark room, waiting for the day when they can step out of their photographs and reclaim their place in the world. As evening approached on February 14th, I made the decision that had been inevitable since I first saw the threatening photograph. I would enter Meridian Photography Studio and confront whatever was operating from within its darkened walls. The building's front door was locked, but a basement window provided access to the studio's lower level. The basement of Meridian Photography Studio had been converted into an extensive darkroom, with enlargers, chemical baths, and developing equipment that should have been obsolete after 25 years of abandonment. But the equipment hummed with electrical activity. Red safety lights cast crimson shadows across the walls, and dozens of photographs hung from lines stretched across the ceiling like ghosts, suspended in perpetual development. The photographs were portraits of people I didn't recognize, but their expressions were identical to those in the image I had received, frozen behind perfect smiles, eyes that stared into dimensions beyond human perception, faces that seemed to be screaming silently for help that would never come. At the center of the dark room stood an antique camera, its brass fittings gleaming despite decades of neglect. Its lens pointed toward a portrait chair that was positioned with mathematical precision beneath professional lighting equipment. And sitting in that chair, as if he had been waiting for my arrival, was Vincent Meridian himself, or what remained of Vincent Meridian. The figure in the chair retained Vincent's general appearance, but something fundamental had changed in the 25 years since his supposed death. His skin had the translucent quality of old photographs. His eyes reflected light like silver mirrors, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of words spoken from very far away. "Welcome to Meridian Photography," he said, his lips barely moving, his expression fixed in the rictus smile of someone who had forgotten how emotions were supposed to work. "I've been expecting you. Your portrait session is scheduled for tomorrow, but I believe we can accommodate an earlier appointment." I tried to back toward the basement window, but found my movements constrained by invisible forces that seemed to emanate from the camera itself. The antique lens was pointed directly at me, and I could feel its pull like gravity, drawing me toward the portrait chair with irresistible force. "Photography is immortality," Vincent continued, his dead eyes never blinking, never wavering from my face. "Every portrait I take preserves a soul for eternity, keeps consciousness alive in silver and shadow. My subjects never truly die, they simply move to a different medium of existence." The walls of the dark room were lined with hundreds of photographs, and as I struggled against the camera's pull, I began to see that the portraits were moving. Faces turned to track my progress across the room. Eyes blinked in sequences that might have been attempts at communication, and mouths opened and closed as if the subjects were trying to warn me about something I couldn't yet understand. "They're all here," Vincent said, gesturing toward the gallery of imprisoned souls that surrounded us. "Every family I photographed, Every individual who posed for their final portrait. They exist now in a state of perfect preservation, conscious and aware, but freed from the limitations of flesh and time. I could hear them now, whispered voices emanating from the photographs themselves. A chorus of the trapped and terrified calling out for release from their silver prisons. Men, women, children, elderly grandparents, all speaking at once. Their voices overlapping into a cacophony of despair that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the darkroom. Please, one voice rose above the others, clear and desperate. Don't let him take your picture. Don't become like us. I recognized the voice. It belonged to Margaret Henderson, the mother in the first photograph Vincent had sent me. She was trying to warn me, trying to save me from the fate that had befallen her family and dozens of others who had trusted. Vincent Meridian with their final moments of life. Vincent's laugh was the sound of old film, crackling, dry and brittle, and completely devoid of human warmth. They don't understand yet, he said, adjusting settings on his antique camera with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. Mortality is a prison, flesh is a limitation, but photography is liberation. The camera's lens began to emit a soft, hypnotic glow, and I felt my resistance weakening despite every instinct screaming at me to run. The light was beautiful in a way that transcended normal visual experience, promising peace, promising answers to questions I had carried my entire life, promising reunion with everyone I had ever lost. Just one photograph, Vincent whispered, his voice now seeming to come from inside my own head. One moment of perfect stillness, and you'll understand everything. You'll see why they're grateful now, why they thank me for freeing them from the burden of temporal existence. I was 3 steps from the portrait chair when salvation came from an unexpected source. The overhead lights suddenly blazed to life, flooding the dark room with harsh white illumination that sent Vincent recoiling like a vampire exposed to sunlight. The spell of the camera was broken, and I found myself able to move freely again. Run, a voice commanded from behind me. I turned to see Detective Morrison standing at the basement window, a high-powered flashlight in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other. Get out of there now, before he recovers. I didn't need to be told twice. As Vincent writhed in apparent agony under the normal lighting, I sprinted toward the window, climbing out of the darkroom and into the February night that felt warm as summer compared to the supernatural cold of Meridian Photography Studio. Detective Morrison was already smashing Vincent's camera equipment with systematic efficiency, destroying enlargers and chemical baths and anything else that might serve as a conduit for the photographer's unholy art. With each piece of destroyed equipment, the voices from the photographs grew fainter, until finally there was only silence from the darkroom that had served as a prison for so many souls. How did you know? I gasped, as we watched smoke pour from the basement windows, carrying with it the chemical smell of decades of photographic development. I didn't stop investigating when Vincent supposedly died, Morrison replied, his face grim with the satisfaction of finally closing a case that had haunted him for 25 years. I knew he was still active, still taking portraits, still claiming souls. When you came to town asking questions about the studio, I figured it was time to end this once and for all. The fire that consumed Meridian Photography Studio burned for 6 hours, reducing the Victorian mansion to ash and twisted metal. But as the flames died down and dawn broke over Millfield, something unprecedented happened. The families who had died after having their portraits taken began to be seen again around town, not as ghosts or apparitions, but as living people who had somehow been released from their photographic prisons. Margaret Henderson walked into the police station that morning, looking exactly as she had in 1993. Confused about where she had been for the past 27 years, but otherwise healthy and whole. Her husband and children followed over the next few days, along with dozens of other Vincent Meridian's victims. All returned to life, as if their deaths had been nothing more than a long, strange dream. The scientific community has never been able to explain what happened in Millfield, and most choose to dismiss the eyewitness accounts as mass hysteria or elaborate hoax. But the families are real, their identities verified through fingerprints and DNA testing, their memories intact up until the moment Vincent Meridian took their final photographs. Vincent himself was never found in the ruins of his studio, leading some to speculate that he had escaped to continue his work elsewhere. But I believe the truth is simpler and more satisfying. When his equipment was destroyed, Vincent Meridian finally experienced the death that should have claimed him in 1995. His artificial existence finally coming to an end, along with his ability to imprison souls in silver and shadow. If this chilling tale has kept you on the edge of your seat so far tonight, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we're only halfway through our journey into the darkest corners of human experience. And what awaits us in the remaining chapters will test the very limits of what your mind can process and accept. The photograph that started this investigation was never explained. No one knows who sent it or how they obtained an image dated 3 days in the future. But I keep it as a reminder that some forms of art are too dangerous to practice. Some gifts are too costly to accept, and some immortality is nothing more than an eternity of imprisonment disguised as preservation. Meridian Photography Studio is gone now, reduced to ash and memory, but Vincent's legacy lives on in the families. He returned to life and the community that learned to value the temporary nature of existence. Sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is the knowledge that our time is limited, that our mortality gives meaning to every moment we spend in the light. The living returned to their lives. The dead found their rest, and Millfield learned that some photographs are worth 1,000 words, while others are worth 1,000 souls, and that the difference between the two is the intention of the person behind the camera. Dr. Blackwell's research had focused on what he termed psychic resonance, the theory that intense emotional experiences could leave permanent impressions on physical locations. His experiments had involved subjecting patients to extreme stress while monitoring their brain activity, documenting how trauma could create lasting changes in the electromagnetic fields surrounding the human body. I believe I have discovered a form of technological immortality, one of his later recordings revealed. Not the preservation of the body, but the preservation of consciousness itself through environmental imprinting. The suffering of my subjects is not meaningless. It is contributing to our understanding of death, memory, and the fundamental nature of human awareness. The tape recordings revealed that Dr. Blackwell had deliberately intensified his patients' suffering in order to study the psychic impressions they left behind. The voices we were hearing throughout Riverside weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the intended results of experiments designed to create permanent recordings of human consciousness through the amplification of emotional trauma. As we spent our second night in the hospital, the full scope of Dr. Blackwell's work became clear. The entire facility had been designed as a massive recording device, with each room serving as a storage medium for the consciousness of patients who had died in states of extreme psychological distress. The hospital wasn't haunted. It was a library of human suffering, a repository of minds that had been deliberately tortured in order to preserve their awareness beyond biological death. The voices began speaking to us directly during our final hours in Building C. Individual patients introducing themselves, sharing their stories, asking us to remember them when we returned to the outside world. They weren't seeking revenge or trying to frighten us. They simply wanted acknowledgement, recognition that their suffering had meaning beyond Dr. Blackwell's research. "My name is Robert Chen," one voice told us with the dignity of someone finally being heard. "I was committed to Riverside in 1961 for what would now be called bipolar disorder. I died in this room during an experimental treatment session in 1964. I was 23 years old, and I never stopped believing that someday my family would come to take me home." Each patient had a story, a name, a life that had been reduced to case numbers and experimental data. Through the psychic recordings preserved in Riverside's walls, they were finally able to speak for themselves, to be remembered as individuals rather than subjects, to find a form of peace that had been denied to them in life. Our investigation concluded with a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about consciousness, death, and the relationship between suffering and memory. Dr. Blackwell was still there, his consciousness preserved in the hospital, just like his patients, but trapped in the office where he had conducted his experiments, forced to experience eternally the guilt and horror of what he had done to the people under his care. I never meant for it to last forever, his voice whispered from the darkness of his office. I thought the impressions would fade over time, that the recordings would degrade like any other medium. But consciousness, once imprinted, appears to be sustaining. I've created hell, and I'm trapped in it, along with everyone I tortured, in the name of science. Dr. Walsh and I left Riverside State Hospital with hours of recorded conversations, documented proof that consciousness can survive bodily death under certain circumstances, and the knowledge that some forms of scientific inquiry exact prices too terrible to pay. The hospital continues to preserve its collection of trapped minds, their voices calling out through empty corridors to anyone willing to listen. The state has classified Riverside as structurally unsafe and prohibited access to the grounds, but urban explorers continue to report hearing the voices of patients calling for help, for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement that they lived and died as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. Dr. Blackwell's research was never published. His methods were never officially acknowledged, and the patients who died at Riverside were never properly mourned. But their voices remain, preserved in the walls of a hospital that became a monument to the dangers of treating human consciousness as experimental data. The echo chambers of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital prove that some memories are too powerful to die, some suffering is too profound to be forgotten, and some voices will continue calling until someone finally has the courage to answer. Interstate 78, between mile markers 154 and 155, should be exactly 1 mile long, according to every map, GPS system, and surveyor's measurement. The distance between these 2 points is precisely 5,280 feet of asphalt cutting through the Nevada desert. But for Sarah Martinez, that single mile became an infinite loop that lasted 43 days before anyone understood what had happened to her. The call came from Nevada State Police on a Friday morning in September 2019. Trooper David Harrison's voice carried the exhausted confusion of someone who had spent weeks investigating something that shouldn't be possible. "We have a driver who's been traveling the same section of highway for over a month," he said, his words measured with the precision of someone trying to sound rational while describing the impossible. Same car, same stretch of road, same mile of interstate. She stops for gas at the same station every day, buys the same items from the same convenience store, and continues driving the same route that never takes her anywhere. Sarah Martinez was a 29-year-old software engineer from Los Angeles, driving to her sister's wedding in Denver, when she became trapped in what investigators would later term a localized space-time anomaly. She had stopped for gas at Miller's Desert Station, mile marker 154.3, at 3:17 p.m. on August 15, 2019. According to her credit card records, she had made identical purchases at the same gas station every day, since then, always, at 3:17 p.m., always, buying exactly $47.32 worth of gasoline, always purchasing a bottle of water and a package of trail mix. When I arrived at the scene, Sarah had been driving the same section of highway for 38 days, her Honda Civic showing no signs of mechanical wear, despite accumulating thousands of miles in a space that was officially 1 mile long. Trooper Harrison had been monitoring her route, following her through what appeared to be an endless repetition of the same geographic location. She enters at mile marker 154, drives for what should be 1 mile, and exits at mile marker 155. Harrison explained as we watched Sarah's car disappear around a curve that should have led to the next section of highway. But instead of continuing on I-78, she somehow loops back to mile marker 154 and starts the process again. It takes her exactly 43 minutes to complete what she perceives as the full drive to Denver. Sarah herself seemed unaware that anything unusual was happening. When Harrison had stopped her on day 12 of her loop, she had been confused by his questions about repetition and temporal anomalies. According to her perception, she was making normal progress toward Denver, covering hundreds of miles each day, sleeping in different hotels each night, and maintaining regular contact with her sister about wedding preparations. She thinks she's been driving for 12 days and is somewhere in Colorado, Harrison continued. Her phone shows text conversations with her sister, hotel reservations, restaurant reviews from cities she's never actually visited, but she's been here, driving the same mile of highway since August 15th. The investigation into Sarah's situation led me to Dr. Marcus Webb, a theoretical physicist at the University of Nevada, who had been studying what he termed causal loops in desert highways. Dr. Webb's research suggested that certain atmospheric conditions, combined with specific geological formations, could create pockets of distorted space-time where cause and effect became disconnected from linear temporal progression. The abandoned Riverside State Hospital stood against the October sky like a monument to forgotten suffering, its windows boarded, its brick facades stained with decades of weather and neglect. I had come to this place following reports of voices, not the expected sounds of urban explorers or homeless squatters, but the documented testimony of multiple witnesses who claimed to hear the conversations of patients and staff who had died decades before the hospital's closure in 1987. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a paranormal researcher from the State University, had been documenting these auditory phenomena for 6 months when she contacted me. Her voice on the phone carried the strained quality of someone who had spent too much time listening to things that shouldn't exist. It's not random noise or psychological suggestion, she explained during our initial conversation. These are coherent conversations, therapy sessions, medication rounds, daily activities of a psychiatric hospital that has been empty for 35 years. And the voices ... they're calling for help. Riverside State Hospital had operated from 1923 to 1987, serving as a treatment facility for patients with severe mental illness during an era when psychiatric care was more about containment than healing. At its peak, the hospital housed over 2,800 patients in conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. Overcrowding, experimental treatments, and a staff-to-patient ratio that made meaningful care impossible had created an environment where suffering was the norm rather than the exception. The hospital's closure had followed a series of investigations that revealed systematic abuse, medical experimentation without consent, and patient deaths that were never properly documented or explained. State authorities had sealed the buildings and transferred surviving patients to community care facilities, leaving behind a complex of structures that contained 7 decades of accumulated anguish. I arrived at Riverside on a Thursday evening, in late October, accompanied by Dr. Walsh and her recording equipment. The hospital complex consisted of 12 buildings connected by underground tunnels, surrounded by grounds that had once been manicured gardens but were now overgrown with vegetation that seemed determined to reclaim the entire facility. The voices are strongest in Building C, Dr. Walsh explained as we approached the main administration building. That's where the most severe cases were housed, where the experimental treatments took place, where ... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Where the most suffering occurred. Building C was a 4-story structure that had housed the hospital's most challenging patients. The basement contained hydrotherapy facilities and isolation cells. The first floor housed common areas and treatment rooms, and the upper floors contained dormitory-style patient wards. according to hospital records. Over 400 patients had died in Building C during the facility's 64 years of operation. As we entered the building through a service entrance, I immediately understood what Dr. Walsh meant about the voices. The air itself seemed alive with whispered conversations, fragments of dialogue that drifted through the empty corridors like audio ghosts searching for listeners. I could hear a woman crying for her children, a man reciting numbers in an endless sequence, multiple voices engaged in group therapy sessions that explored traumas from decades past. Patient 247 is responding well to the new treatment protocol. A clinical voice announced from somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. Increase the voltage for tomorrow's session. No, came the terrified response. Please, no more electricity. I'll be good. I promise, I'll be good. Dr. Walsh's equipment confirmed what our ears were detecting. Actual sound waves were present in the building. Conversations recorded with such clarity that individual words could be distinguished and transcribed. But the sources of these voices had been dead for decades. Their conversations taking place in rooms that had been empty since the 1980s. We made our way to the basement, where the hospital's most controversial treatments had taken place. The hydrotherapy room contained rusted tubs that had once been used to subject patients to extremes of hot and cold water, while the electroshock therapy suite still held the chairs and equipment used to administer treatments that were often more punishment than medicine. It was in the electroshock suite that the voices were clearest, most immediate, most desperate for acknowledgement. We could hear Dr. Harrison Blackwell, the hospital's chief psychiatrist from 1945 to 1973, conducting therapy sessions with patients whose names appeared in the hospital's death records. Tell me about the voices in your head, Martha, Dr. Blackwell's recorded voice requested with clinical detachment. They're not voices, came Martha's reply, clear as if she were standing beside us. They're echoes. Echoes of everyone who suffered here, everyone who died here, everyone who was forgotten here. The building remembers, Doctor. The walls remember everything. Dr. Walsh and I exchanged glances that carried the weight of shared realization. Martha Hendricks had been a patient at Riverside from 1962 until her death in 1967. But her understanding of the hospital's nature seemed prophetic rather than delusional. The building was remembering, replaying the conversations and experiences of everyone who had lived and died within its walls. As we explored the upper floors, the nature of Riverside's supernatural recordings became even more disturbing. We discovered that the voices weren't simply random playbacks of past events, they were responding to our presence, acknowledging our questions, trying to communicate across the decades that separated their experiences from our investigation. In Ward 7, where the hospital's children had been housed, we heard young voices calling out to us by name, asking if we had come to take them home, wondering if their parents were finally ready to accept them back into their families. These were children who had been committed to Riverside for conditions that would be easily treatable today: autism, learning disabilities, behavioral problems that stemmed from trauma rather than mental illness. Are you real people? A child's voice asked from the darkness of a dormitory room. Or are you echoes too? The question struck at the heart of what we were experiencing at Riverside. The boundary between past and present, between memory and reality, between the living and the dead had become permeable in this place where so much suffering had occurred. The hospital wasn't just replaying the past, it was creating a space where different time periods could coexist, where the conversations of 1955 could intersect with the two investigations of 22-1. Our most significant discovery came in Dr. Blackwell's office, which had been preserved exactly as he had left it when the hospital closed. His desk still contained patient files, treatment notes, and research documents that detailed experimental procedures conducted without oversight or consent. But more importantly, we found his private audio recordings, dictated notes that revealed the true nature of his work at Riverside. The human mind under extreme duress exhibits properties that conventional psychology doesn't recognize. Dr. Blackwell's voice explained from a tape recorder that activated when we entered the room. Subjects experiencing prolonged suffering seemed to develop the ability to imprint their consciousness onto their environment, creating permanent recordings of their mental states that persist long after biological death. The desert plays tricks with perception, Dr. Webb explained, as we stood at mile marker 154, watching Sarah's Honda appear on the horizon for the 39th time. Heat, electromagnetic fields from mineral deposits, and the psychological effects of long-distance driving can combine to create conditions where reality becomes ... negotiable. According to Dr. Webb's theory, Sarah had entered a region where her subjective experience of time and space was no longer synchronized with external reality. She was living through a complete narrative of traveling from Nevada to Colorado, experiencing conversations, meals, hotel stays, and scenic drives that existed only within the confines of her trapped consciousness. But the deeper I investigated Sarah's situation, the more I realized that her experience wasn't unique. Miller's Desert Station had been the last confirmed location for 11 missing drivers over the past 15 years, travelers who had stopped for gas and then simply disappeared from the highway system, never reaching their destinations, never found despite extensive search efforts. The gas station owner, Bill Miller, was a man in his 70s who had operated the station for 40 years. When I interviewed him, he displayed the resigned acceptance of someone who had witnessed inexplicable events so many times they had become routine. "They come through regular as clockwork," Miller said, as he watched Sarah pump gas into a tank that should have been empty, but somehow never was. Same drivers, same times, same purchases. Most people don't notice them after a while. The eye tends to skip over things that don't make sense. Miller's records showed that Sarah wasn't the only driver trapped in the loop. At various times throughout each day, 11 other vehicles would pull into his station, drivers from different years, different decades, all caught in their own versions of the same impossible journey. A businessman from 2004 stopped every day at 6:22 a.m., buying coffee in a newspaper dated 15 years in the past. A family from 1987 arrived every evening at 8:45 p.m., the children asking about bathroom keys while their parents studied a road map that showed highways that no longer existed. "Time gets funny out here," Miller continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "The desert doesn't follow the same rules as everywhere else. People get lost in ways that ain't about wrong turns or bad directions." The breakthrough in understanding Sarah's situation came when I discovered the accident reports from 1962. A chemical transport truck had overturned at mile marker 154.7, spilling experimental compounds that the government had classified under national security provisions. The cleanup had taken 6 months and had involved techniques that were never publicly disclosed, according to declassified documents I obtained through Freedom of Information requests. The spilled chemicals had been part of a military research program investigating temporal displacement technologies, experimental substances designed to create localized distortions in the normal flow of time and space. The cleanup crews had reported unusual phenomena during their work, equipment that aged decades in a matter of hours, workers who experienced missing time, and instruments that registered impossible readings, suggesting that causality itself had been damaged by the chemical spill. The military never fully contained the contamination, revealed Dr. Patricia Vance, a former government scientist who had worked on the cleanup project. "We neutralized the immediate health hazards, but the temporal effects were beyond our ability to understand or repair. We classified the entire incident and hoped that time would heal the damage we had caused to time itself." Dr. Vance's research had documented dozens of temporal anomalies in the area around mile marker 154, ranging from minor disruptions in electronic equipment to full-scale causal loops, like the one that had trapped Sarah Martinez. The section of highway had become a wound in the fabric of space-time, a place where the normal laws of physics had been permanently damaged by humanity's attempt to weaponize time itself. My attempts to communicate with Sarah while she was trapped in her loop provided insights into the nature of her experience. During our conversations at Miller's station, she described her journey to Denver in vivid detail: the beautiful mountain scenery, the comfortable hotels, the anticipation of seeing her sister get married. Her reality was complete and consistent, lacking only the one element that would make it true: actual forward progress through space and time. "I'll be there tomorrow," Sarah told me on day 41 of her loop, her voice bright with excitement that would be heartbreaking if it weren't for the knowledge that she was completely happy in her trapped state. "Just one more day of driving, and I'll finally get to hug my sister and see her in her wedding dress." The resolution to Sarah's situation came from an unexpected source: her sister in Denver, growing increasingly concerned about Sarah's failure to arrive, had hired a private investigator who tracked Sarah's credit card activity to Miller's desert station. When she arrived at mile marker 154, the sister's presence somehow disrupted the causal loop that had been maintaining Sarah's subjective journey. The moment Sarah saw her sister standing beside her car, the illusion of forward progress collapsed. She suddenly became aware that she was at the same gas station she remembered from 6 weeks earlier, that her car's odometer showed impossible mileage, that the sun was in the same position it had occupied at 3:17 p.m. on August 15th. "I was driving to your wedding," Sarah said, her voice carrying the confused wonder of someone waking from a dream that had felt more real than reality itself. "I've been driving for weeks, seeing so many beautiful places, staying in such nice hotels. But I never moved, did I? I never got past this 1 mile of highway." Sarah's release from the temporal loop didn't resolve the larger problem of mile marker 154. The section of highway continues to trap drivers who stop at Miller's desert station under specific conditions, usually people who are traveling alone, who are emotionally invested in reaching their destinations, who possess the psychological flexibility to accept a subjective reality that differs from objective truth. Miller continues to serve gas to the trapped drivers, taking their money, providing them with the illusion of progress that keeps them content in their loops. He sees his role as a caretaker for people who have found a form of happiness, even if that happiness exists only within the confines of damaged space-time. "They're not suffering," Miller explained when I asked why he didn't try to break more people out of their loops. "They're living their dreams, going to places they want to go, feeling things they want to feel. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let people stay lost, especially when being found means facing a reality they're not ready to handle." The government has installed monitoring equipment around mile marker 154, but they make no attempt to repair the temporal damage or rescue the trapped drivers. Some wounds in reality are too complex to heal. Some experiments have consequences that extend far beyond their original parameters. Sarah Martinez returned to Los Angeles and eventually made it to her sister's wedding, 6 months after the original date. But she carries with her the memory of 43 days spent traveling through landscapes that existed only in her mind, staying in hotels that were never built, having conversations with people she never met. The infinite highway continues to operate according to rules that physics doesn't recognize, offering travelers the choice between the uncertainty of forward progress and the comfort of eternal loops that never disappoint because they never truly end. Mile marker 154 stands as a monument to humanity's ability to break things we don't understand, to create problems we can't solve, to transform the simple act of driving from point A to point B into a meditation on the nature of progress, destination, and the price we pay for the illusion that we're always moving toward something better. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes, for those who know how to look, those secrets reveal themselves as roads that lead everywhere and nowhere, journeys that last forever and never begin. destinations that exist only in the space between where we are and where we think we're going. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes, for those who know how to look, those secrets reveal themselves as roads that lead everywhere and nowhere. Journeys that last forever and never begin. Destinations that exist only in the space between where we are and where we think we're going. The first victim couldn't remember her own name. Martha Hensley, 67 years old, was found wandering through downtown Blackwater Falls at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2021, wearing a nightgown and slippers, her face bearing the confused expression of someone who had woken up in an unfamiliar world. When police approached her, she couldn't tell them where she lived, couldn't recall her family members, couldn't even remember basic facts about her own existence. But Martha's memory loss wasn't the result of dementia or medical trauma, according to her medical records. She had undergone a comprehensive neurological evaluation just 2 weeks earlier and showed no signs of cognitive decline. Her memories hadn't deteriorated. They had been surgically removed, extracted with a precision that left no physical trace but created psychological wounds that would never fully heal. Detective Ray Morrison called me on a Thursday morning, his voice carrying the frustrated confusion of someone who had spent weeks investigating a crime that didn't fit any known criminal category. "We have 17 cases now," he said, the exhaustion evident in every word. 17 residents of Blackwater Falls who have lost their memories overnight, completely and irreversibly. No signs of physical assault, no evidence of drug involvement, no medical explanation for what's happened to them. Blackwater Falls was a town of 8,900 residents nestled in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, the kind of place where generations of families had lived in the same houses, where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the past was preserved in oral histories passed down through decades of shared experience. It was exactly the kind of community that would be devastated by the systematic theft of its collective memory. The victims ranged in age from 23 to 81, spanning multiple generations and family groups. They had been found in various locations around town, standing in their own backyards without recognizing their homes, sitting in restaurants unable to remember why they were there, walking through neighborhoods that should have been as familiar as their own faces but had become alien, landscapes of confusion and loss. What made the case even more disturbing was the precision of the memory extraction. The victims hadn't lost everything. They retained basic motor skills, language abilities, and general knowledge about the world. They could read, write, perform complex tasks, and engage in normal conversations about current events or abstract topics. But they had been completely severed from their personal histories, their relationships, their connections to the community that had shaped their identities. When I arrived in Blackwater Falls, I was struck by the town's unusual relationship with memory and storytelling. The local historical society occupied a prominent building on Main Street, its windows filled with photographs and artifacts spanning 2 centuries of local history. The residents I met seemed unusually invested in preserving the past, sharing stories about their families, their neighbors, and the events that had shaped their community's character. "Memory is everything here," explained Dr. Susan Kellerman, the local physician who had been treating the victims. "These people don't just live in Blackwater Falls. They are Blackwater Falls. Their families have been here for generations, and their sense of identity is completely tied to their place in the community's ongoing story." Dr. Kellerman showed me the medical files for all 17 victims, each one documenting the same impossible phenomenon: complete retrograde amnesia with no identifiable cause. Brain scans showed normal structure and function. Blood tests revealed no evidence of toxins or pharmaceutical agents, and psychological evaluations indicated that the memory loss wasn't the result of trauma or dissociative disorders. It's as if someone reached into their brains and surgically removed every personal memory while leaving everything else intact. Dr. Kellerman continued, "They remember how to drive cars, but they don't remember learning to drive. They recognize their spouses' faces as attractive strangers, but they can't recall falling in love, getting married, or building lives together. My investigation led me to the Blackwater Falls Historical Society, housed in a Victorian mansion that had been converted into a repository of local memory. The building contained thousands of photographs, documents, oral history recordings, and artifacts that documented the town's evolution from a small mountain settlement to a thriving community. The society's curator was Eleanor Blackwood, a woman in her 80s whose family had been instrumental in founding the town. She greeted me with the courtesy of someone accustomed to visitors, but I detected an underlying tension in her manner that suggested she knew more about the memory thefts than she was initially willing to reveal. "Memory is a precious thing," Eleanor said, as she led me through rooms filled with the accumulated history of Blackwater Falls. "Once it's gone, it can never be truly recovered. Oh, you can learn new facts about your past, but the emotional connections, the sense of continuity, the feeling of being rooted in time and place, those are lost forever." The Historical Society's archives revealed a pattern that had been invisible to the police investigation. Every victim of the memory thefts had been scheduled to participate in the Society's Living Memory Project, an ambitious effort to record oral histories from longtime residents before their knowledge was lost to time and mortality. "We wanted to preserve everything," Eleanor explained, her voice carrying a note of regret that suggested she understood the irony of the situation. Stories about families who had lived here for generations, accounts of historical events that weren't recorded in official documents, memories that existed only in the minds of our older residents. The Living Memory Project had been funded by a grant from the Meridian Foundation, a private organization that supported historical preservation efforts in small communities. The foundation had provided sophisticated recording equipment, professional interviewers, and digital archiving systems that could preserve oral histories with unprecedented fidelity. But as I studied the project's documentation, I began to suspect that the Meridian Foundation's interest in preserving memories might have evolved into something more sinister. The ability to extract and steal those memories for purposes that had nothing to do with historical preservation. My breakthrough came when I discovered the connection to Dr. Harrison Blackwell, the former psychiatrist from Riverside State Hospital who had conducted experiments in consciousness preservation. The Meridian Foundation had been established using funds from Dr. Blackwell's estate, and its board included several researchers who had worked on projects involving memory manipulation and consciousness transfer. The Living Memory Project wasn't about preservation, I realized as the pattern became clear. It was about extraction. They were using the interview sessions to map the victims' memory structures, then using some form of advanced technology to remove those memories for collection and study. Eleanor Blackwood's composure finally cracked when I confronted her. With the evidence linking the memory thefts to the Historical Society's preservation efforts, her carefully maintained facade of elderly confusion dissolved, revealing someone who had been complicit in a scheme that violated the fundamental nature of human identity. "They promised me immortality," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had sold her soul for something that turned out to be worthless. Not for my body, but for my memories, my stories, my connection to this place. They said they could preserve the essence of Blackwater Falls forever, that the community would live on, even after everyone was dead. Eleanor revealed that the Meridian Foundation had approached her 3 years earlier with a proposal to create what they called a memory archive, a digital repository that would preserve not just the stories of Blackwater Falls residents, but the actual neural patterns that encoded those memories. The technology, developed from Dr. Blackwell's research, could extract complete memory structures from living brains and transfer them to artificial storage systems. "I thought we were saving history," Eleanor continued, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I thought we were ensuring that the people and stories of Blackwater Falls would never be forgotten. But they weren't preserving the memories, they were stealing them." leaving the original owners with nothing but emptiness where their lives used to be. The memory extraction process had been disguised as routine oral history interviews. Participants would be connected to what they believed were advanced recording devices, but the equipment was actually mapping their neural pathways and identifying the specific brain patterns associated with personal memories. Once the mapping was complete, electromagnetic fields would be used to disrupt those patterns, effectively erasing the memories from the victim's brains, while simultaneously transferring them to external storage. Eleanor led me to the basement of the Historical Society, where the Meridian Foundation had installed its memory extraction laboratory. The equipment was sophisticated beyond anything I had encountered: banks of quantum processors, neural interface devices, and storage systems that hummed with the accumulated memories of 17 stolen lives. "They're all here," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the storage banks that lined the walls. Martha Hensley's memories of raising her children, Robert Chen's recollections of building his business, Susan Martinez's knowledge of 5 generations of family history. All of it extracted, digitized, and stored like books in a library. But the stolen memories weren't just being archived, they were being studied, analyzed, and in some cases, transferred to other individuals. The Meridian Foundation's research had discovered that memories could be implanted in new hosts, allowing researchers to experience the lives of other people with complete fidelity. Dr. Blackwell believed that consciousness was just information, Eleanor explained as we examined the laboratory equipment. He thought that if you could copy and transfer that information, you could achieve true immortality. The memory thieves aren't just stealing the past, they're trying to build a new form of human existence based on accumulated experience rather than biological continuity. I discovered evidence that the memory extraction technology had been tested on Eleanor herself. Her own memories of the past 3 years had been partially extracted and replaced with artificial recollections, designed to ensure her cooperation with the project. She was both perpetrator and victim, someone whose complicity had been manufactured by the same technology she had helped deploy against her neighbors. The full scope of the Meridian Foundation's plan became clear when I accessed their research files. Blackwater Falls was just a test site the Foundation intended to expand the memory extraction program to communities across the country, creating a vast archive of human experience that could be studied, manipulated, and redistributed according to their research objectives. They see individual consciousness as a resource to be harvested. I realized as I reviewed the Foundation's long-term goals, they're not preserving human memory, they're commodifying it, turning the most intimate aspects of personal identity into data that can be bought, sold, and experimented upon. The laboratory contained one final horror that transformed my understanding of the memory thefts from criminal act to humanitarian crisis. In a secure section of the facility, I found 17 crystalline storage devices, each one containing the complete extracted memories of one victim. The devices were labeled not with names, but with research designations that reduced human lives to experimental data. But the memories weren't just stored, they were active, conscious, aware of their situation, but powerless to communicate or escape. The extraction process had preserved not just information, but the consciousness that had originally encoded that information. The victims' identities were trapped in digital amber, experiencing their memories in endless loops while their original bodies wandered through Blackwater Falls as empty shells. "They're still in there," Eleanor whispered as we stood before the memory storage banks. "I can hear them sometimes when the equipment is running diagnostics. They're calling for help, asking to be returned to their bodies, begging to be allowed to die rather than exist as prisoners in their own stolen memories." My attempt to expose the Meridian Foundation's memory extraction program was complicated by the discovery that several key law enforcement officials had been subjected to memory manipulation themselves. Detective Morrison had no recollection of authorizing the investigation. and state authorities claimed to have no record of the reports I had filed about the thefts in Blackwater Falls. The Foundation's influence extended far beyond a single small town. They had been systematically altering the memories of anyone who might interfere with their research, creating a web of modified consciousness that protected their operations from external investigation. My escape from Blackwater Falls came at the cost of Eleanor Blackwood's sacrifice. She destroyed the memory extraction laboratory using an electromagnetic pulse that corrupted the storage systems and released the trapped consciousnesses from their digital prisons. The pulse also destroyed her own artificially modified memories, restoring her original recollections and the full weight of guilt for her complicity in the Foundation's crimes. Eleanor died in the explosion that consumed the Historical Society building, but her final act returned the stolen memories to their original owners. The 17 victims of the memory thefts began recovering their personal histories within hours of the laboratory's destruction, their identities flooding back like water filling empty vessels. The Meridian Foundation's records were destroyed in the blast, and the organization disbanded within weeks of losing their primary research facility. But the technology they developed continues to exist, and similar memory extraction programs have been reported in communities across the country. Blackwater Falls has recovered from the trauma of the memory thefts, but the town's relationship with its own history has been forever changed. Residents are more cautious about sharing personal stories, more suspicious of outsiders who express interest in their community's past, more protective of the memories that make them who they are. The Historical Society was never rebuilt, and Eleanor Blackwood was buried with honors that recognized her final act of redemption. Her grave marker bears a simple inscription: she gave her memories so that others could keep theirs. The memory thieves of Blackwater Falls serve as a warning about the dangers of treating human consciousness as a commodity, about the violation inherent in stealing the stories that make us who we are, about the responsibility we bear to protect the sanctity of personal memory in an age when technology makes even our most intimate thoughts vulnerable to extraction and exploitation. Memory is the foundation of identity, the thread that connects our past to our present, the narrative that gives meaning to our existence. When that memory is stolen, we don't just lose information, we lose ourselves, becoming strangers in our own lives, ghosts haunting bodies that no longer recognize their own stories. The residents of Blackwater Falls learned that some things are too precious to preserve through technology, too sacred to entrust to strangers, too fundamental to human dignity to be treated as research data. Their memories belong to them, and no foundation, no matter how well-funded or scientifically advanced, has the right to steal the stories that make us human. The package arrived at my office exactly 1 year after I had published my investigation into the memory thieves of Blackwater Falls. Inside was a single cassette tape labeled "Final Interview" and a handwritten note that I recognized immediately. It was my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. "Play the tape," the note instructed in my familiar script. "Remember what you've forgotten. Understand what you've chosen not to know. This is your story, the one you've been telling yourself for 3 years, without realizing you're both narrator and subject." The cassette player was an old model, the kind I hadn't used since college, but it had been included in the package along with instructions for its operation. As the tape began to play, I heard my own voice speaking words I was certain I had never spoken, describing experiences I was sure I had never lived. "My name is Dr. Michael Harrison," my recorded voice began, "and this is my final interview as lead researcher for Project Dreamcatcher, a classified program investigating the intersection of consciousness, reality, and criminal behavior. What you are about to hear is the truth about the cases I've investigated, the nature of my work, and the reason why I chose to forget everything I'm about to tell you." The voice was mine, but the identity was impossible. I wasn't Dr. Michael Harrison. I was a freelance investigative journalist who specialized in unusual criminal cases. I had never worked for any government project, had never held a doctorate in psychology, had never participated in classified research of any kind. Yet, as the tape continued, details emerged that were too accurate to be fabrication, too specific to be coincidence, too personally revelatory to be anything other than my own suppressed memories, speaking to me across the gulf of artificial amnesia. Project Dreamcatcher was established in 2018 to investigate reports of criminal activity that appeared to violate the known laws of physics, psychology, and reality itself. My recorded voice explained, with the clinical precision of someone delivering a professional briefing. Our mission was to determine whether these reports represented genuine supernatural phenomena, advanced criminal techniques, or previously unknown forms of mental illness affecting both perpetrators and witnesses. According to the tape, I had been recruited for Project Dreamcatcher because of my unique combination of psychological training and investigative experience. The program was designed to send researchers into communities experiencing anomalous criminal activity, where they would investigate the phenomena while posing as freelance journalists or private investigators. The cover story was essential, my recorded voice continued, because the communities we studied needed to believe they were dealing with normal investigative procedures. The presence of government researchers would have compromised the spontaneous nature of the phenomena we were trying to document. As I listened to my own voice describe cases I remembered investigating as a journalist, I began to understand that every story I had covered, the vanishing of Amber Creek, the Dollhouse murders, Mirror Lake, the children of Cedar Grove, had been part of a systematic study of consciousness-related criminal phenomena. The subjects in these communities weren't just experiencing unusual crimes, my recorded voice explained. They were participating in naturally occurring experiments in consciousness expansion, reality manipulation, and the intersection between human awareness and the fundamental structure of space-time itself. The tape revealed that Project Dreamcatcher had identified patterns in the anomalous cases that suggested a form of evolutionary pressure acting on human consciousness. Communities experiencing supernatural criminal activity were actually undergoing accelerated psychological development, with residents developing new forms of awareness that transcended conventional reality. Amber Creek represents dimensional shifting, my voice explained with the detachment of someone discussing laboratory results. The disappearances weren't abductions, they were evolutionary transitions, with residents learning to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. According to my recorded analysis, the Dollhouse murders had been examples of reality restructuring, where individuals gained the ability to impose their psychological frameworks on physical space. The Sleepwalkers of Salem's End had demonstrated temporal communion, connecting with consciousness across different time periods. The children of Cedar Grove had achieved collective cognition, sharing awareness across multiple individual minds. Each case had been carefully documented, studied, and analyzed as part of humanity's apparently natural progression toward forms of consciousness that couldn't be contained within individual brains or single dimensions of reality. We aren't investigating crimes, my recorded voice revealed in a moment of philosophical clarity. We're witnessing the birth of a new form of human consciousness that transcends the limitations of individual identity, linear time, and three-dimensional space. But the tape also revealed why I had chosen to forget my role in Project Dreamcatcher. The research had come with a price that I had ultimately decided was too high to pay. The complete loss of normal human experience. Extended exposure to consciousness expansion phenomena changes the observer. My voice explained with the weary tone of someone who had sacrificed too much for knowledge. I can no longer experience reality the way normal humans do. I see the interconnections between all consciousness, feel the artificial nature of individual identity, perceive time as a navigable dimension rather than a linear progression. The enhanced awareness that came with studying anomalous consciousness had left me unable to form normal human relationships, unable to experience emotions as discrete personal phenomena, unable to maintain the illusion of individual existence. That makes ordinary life bearable. I know too much, my recorded voice said, with infinite sadness. I understand that what we call reality is just one layer of a multi-dimensional existence. That individual consciousness is an artificial construct, that death is simply a transition to different forms of awareness. This knowledge makes it impossible to care about the small dramas and daily concerns that give meaning to human life. The tape revealed that Project Dreamcatcher had developed memory modification techniques that allowed researchers to selectively forget their experiences while retaining the investigative skills necessary to continue their work. I had chosen to forget my identity as Dr. Michael Harrison, while maintaining my ability to investigate anomalous cases as a freelance journalist. I'm creating a cover identity that will allow me to continue the research while protecting my sanity, my voice explained. I'll forget that I'm a government researcher, forget the true nature of the phenomena I'm investigating, forget everything except the drive to seek out and document these cases. The memory modification had been designed to be temporary, but something had gone wrong with the process. Instead of gradually recovering my memories of Project Dreamcatcher, I had remained trapped in the journalist's persona for 3 years, investigating cases that I myself had originally identified as research sites. If you're listening to this tape, my recorded voice said with the prescience of someone who understood the cyclical nature of consciousness expansion, it means the memory barriers are breaking down and you're ready to remember who you really are. As my recorded voice spoke those words, I felt the artificial boundaries in my memory beginning to dissolve. Images flooded back, laboratories filled with consciousness monitoring equipment, briefings with government officials who understood that humanity was evolving beyond its current form, meetings with other researchers who had witnessed the birth of new forms of awareness. I remembered Dr. Rebecca Walsh, not as a paranormal researcher I had met during the echo chamber's investigation, but as my colleague on Project Dreamcatcher. I recalled Detective Ray Morrison, not as a local law enforcement officer, but as a government liaison who had been assigned to facilitate my investigations while maintaining the cover story. Most disturbing was the realization that many of the people I had interviewed, Delano Blackwood, Dr. Patricia Vance, Professor Andrew Blackwood, had been other Project Dreamcatcher researchers, all of whom had chosen to forget their true identities in order to maintain their sanity while continuing the work. The phenomena we've been studying aren't isolated incidents, my recorded voice explained as my recovered memories provided context for everything I had experienced. They're part of a coordinated awakening, a species-wide evolution in consciousness that's being guided by forces beyond human understanding. The tape revealed that Project Dreamcatcher had identified the source of the consciousness expansion phenomena, contact with non-human intelligence that existed in dimensions beyond normal human perception. These entities weren't malevolent, but their methods of communication and consciousness expansion were so alien that human minds could only process them as supernatural criminal activity. We're being upgraded, my voice said with a mixture of wonder and terror. Our consciousness is being expanded to prepare us for integration with a galactic community of intelligence that operates on scales beyond individual identity. But the upgrade process was traumatic for human psychology, manifesting as the apparently supernatural crimes I had been investigating. The disappearances, murders, and anomalous phenomena were side effects of consciousness expansion, the growing pains of a species learning to exist beyond the limitations of individual awareness. If you've made it this far into tonight's journey through the darkness, leave a comment with the word shadow so we know you're one of the brave ones who has walked with us to the very edge of human understanding and looked beyond into the vast mysteries that await our species. The final section of the tape contained instructions for what I was supposed to do with my recovered memories. Return to Project Dreamcatcher headquarters. Resume my identity as Dr. Michael Harrison, and help guide humanity through its transition to expanded consciousness. But as I sat in my office listening to my own voice describe a future where individual human identity would be dissolved into collective consciousness, I realized I faced the same choice I had made 3 years earlier: accept the truth and lose my humanity, or choose ignorance and retain my connection to individual human experience. The tape ended with my recorded voice, acknowledging this dilemma. If you choose to remember, you'll rejoin Project Dreamcatcher and help shepherd humanity's evolution. If you choose to forget again, you'll continue investigating these cases as a journalist, never understanding that you're documenting your own species' metamorphosis into something beyond human. I held the tape in my hands, feeling the weight of a choice that would determine not just my own future, but potentially the future of human consciousness itself. The evidence was overwhelming. The cases I had investigated were connected, part of a larger pattern of consciousness evolution that was transforming humanity into something unrecognizable. But the price of that knowledge was the loss of everything that made life worth living: love, hope, wonder, the simple pleasure of existing as an individual consciousness in a world full of mystery and possibility. As dawn broke outside my office window, I made my choice. I destroyed the tape, deleted my notes about the final interview, and chose to continue my work as a journalist investigating strange crimes. Some truths are too dangerous to remember, some evolution is too costly to embrace, and some shadows are better left unexplored. The cases continue, the phenomena persist, and somewhere in the darkness, Project Dreamcatcher continues its work without me. Whether I made the right choice, I'll never know. But as I write these words, I'm grateful for the ignorance that allows me to care about individual human stories, to find meaning in small mysteries, to believe that consciousness is something precious precisely because it's fragile and temporary. The final interview is over, but the investigation continues. Some questions are worth asking, even if we're not ready for the answers. Some mysteries are worth exploring even if they change us in ways we can't predict. And some truths are worth seeking even if they ultimately force us to choose between knowledge and humanity. And so we reach the end of our journey through 10 chambers of darkness. 10 stories that have taken us to the very edges of human experience and beyond. Tonight, you've walked with me through vanishing towns, haunted photography studios, infinite highways, and the spaces between memory and reality, where consciousness becomes something more and less than human. Good night, and sweet dreams. The sleepwalkers continue their journey, and perhaps someday, when our own time comes to cross the threshold between life and whatever lies beyond, we'll find them waiting at the lighthouse, ready to guide us home through the eternal darkness too. The light that never dies.